I see we got a very big, diverse crowd. I'm sure some of you are old hands at the cryptocurrency and blockchain space, and probably most of you are brand new because we're at the beginning of this. I've been a technologist for a long time. Back in the 90s, I started a tech company out of grad school at Carnegie Mellon, which I sold to Lycos, and I was Lycos's Chief Technology Officer back when Lycos was a significant search engine. We were #2 at the time, and this was before the days of Google. And it's been said before, but I can tell you from my own experience that this phase that we're going through now with blockchain and Bitcoin and so on is very similar to the 90s. There's a lot of lessons that were learned then, and we're going through all those same phases again, but even faster. And back then, things were getting very exciting. There was a lot of money flowing into it. People were talking about all the amazing things the internet could do. And we were all excited about it, right? And we're all exploring that space. And it's happening again. And I think the blockchain space is even bigger than what we've done with the internet itself. There's a lot of things you can do with blockchain now as a technology that we can build on top of. And I want to thank Tim Draper for setting up my talk so nicely and talking about digital governance. I think institutions and governance are the big untapped area of blockchain that is now starting to unfold. It's not just about cryptocurrencies and monetary systems as an institution, but every institution that has not yet migrated to the internet, we're about to go down that path. So let's talk about digital governance. This is probably the most important area, as Tim said, that is now unfolding. Why does digital governance matter? Well, there's been a lot of experiments done, and if you look at what happened when Bitcoin first came out, there was a group of people called the cypherpunks, and they were frustrated as technologists, right? They saw what was happening with our institutions, and they saw what was happening with our monetary systems, and said, how can we use technology to solve this problem? That's what technologists do, right? And I was involved with Bitcoin fairly early on too, and I saw what was happening with our institutions. Like if you read any of the polls, right, public confidence in our institutions is at an all-time low. Whether it's governance or the media, people are like, I can't trust any of those things anymore. Well, technology is always a great toolkit of solutions to come out and solve problems with. And the blockchain is a brand new tool, and we are looking at how can we use this new tool and solve a lot of these problems that the internet has not been able to solve by itself so far. And I'll give you a few examples of sort of what's happened so far in the cryptocurrency space. The first reaction, right, was the people creating these new cryptocurrency systems said, you know what, institutions are terrible, governance is terrible, we're just going to have no governance at all, right? Because it's so terrible, we don't want to have these concentrations of power that can be attacked. We just want to have it so that it just operates by itself in a completely decentralized manner. But you can't really truly do that. It's a little bit of a naive view, if you will. And I love Bitcoin. Bitcoin is awesome. I own Bitcoin. It's great. But when you don't really focus in on what governance does, you can't just say you can't have no governance, right? There are going to be group decisions that get made, and somehow those decisions get made. So with Bitcoin, for example, there's been this debate about the block size, right? So if you've been looking at the Bitcoin space for the past year or so, you've seen some very interesting things happen, right? The value took way off, the excitement grew. Exciting things are happening all the time in this space. And people start debating online, what do we do about the fact that we've got this 1 megabyte block size, and the way Satoshi designed this, and Satoshi was a genius, he solved a lot of problems, but he had to look way into the future and say, how is this all going to play out? And he had to make a lot of design choices. Some of those choices were great, and some of them we're now starting to see why they don't quite work the way he thought they might. So the block size, right, is a fixed block size of 1 megabyte, and all the transactions that happen within the past 10 minutes, roughly 10 minutes, have to fit in there. And the idea was, okay, we'll have people compete for that space, and we'll compete with the amount of transaction fees that they're willing to pay. Now, what happened was, as this filled up, that competition just went through the roof because there was so much interest in Bitcoin, and we started seeing transaction fees, $30, $40, $50, right? Now, if you've got $10 in your Bitcoin wallet, you can't even pay $50 to have it transferred somewhere. So this was a real problem. So if you have no official, well-defined digital governance, how do you solve this problem? Well, there's lots of things that are sort of acting as governance, because if you don't have an official governance, decisions are still going to get made. It's just that they're not well defined, and that sort of makes it so that the decisions, that creates uncertainty, and you don't have real clarity on how these decisions are being made, or if they're being made in your own best interest. So we saw this all happen, and the decision was made, we're going to do this segregated witness change, but we weren't going to increase the block size, which is really just a small tweak in the code. A bunch of people got very upset with this and said, hey, you're limiting the value of what Bitcoin could be. Just change this, make the block size bigger so the fees go down, right? And so some of those people just said, hey, I'm just going to take a fork of Bitcoin and create Bitcoin Cash and go in that direction. And that's great. I mean, I think from one sense, from a sense of experimentation and competition, let's try the experiment. Let's try all these different things. That's a good thing. But as far as having something that if you are holding a lot of Bitcoin and you wanted the value of that to be stable and to grow in the best possible way, you might not have been so happy about that. Now, Ethereum is another great example. Ethereum has a different governance model, and sometimes when you have a governance system, you have a set of principles, and if your principle is, the code is the law, whatever happens, happens. We're not going to change anything. If somebody hacks something or a problem arises, whatever happens with the code and the technology, that's how it is. But then something happened about a year and a half ago called the DAO incident, where this thing called the DAO came out. And it was a fantastic platform for investing in new technology. Unfortunately, there was some bugs in the code, and some hackers came in and basically took tens of millions of dollars of Ethereum out of it. And the Ethereum folks basically said, on the one hand, we said whatever happens, happens. On the other hand, we don't really want to get this Ethereum thing going from a place where all of a sudden a big chunk of Ethereum is now in the hands of bad actors, and a lot of the people who are all excited get burnt. This really isn't a good start for us. So they basically went back on their principles, and this was very hotly debated, and said, okay, we're just going to fork the Ethereum. We'll have one side go down, this Ethereum classic road where where in that timeline the hackers get all of that value, and in the other timeline we're going to unroll that. We're going to roll it back, and they're not going to get it, and we'll compete that way. Again, sort of this idea of forking. Tether is another example, more recent example, where you have a coin that is tied to the US dollar. And they said, what we're going to do? We're going to have bank accounts, and we're going to have every coin is going to be backed by an actual US dollar, and we're going to have the ability to redeem your Tether for US dollars. And they stated all this stuff up front. And then the banking system said, you know what? We're not going to do any banking relationships with you. And so they basically cut them all off, and Tether kind of just went back on all of those promises, and it's still functioning, and it still has an important role, but you really don't know what you're getting with Tether or what's going to happen in an extreme situation. Zcash is another example. It's a fantastic new enhancement to privacy using something called ZK snarks, which basically makes it almost impossible to track where value is being transferred from place to place. It truly is a revolutionary technology in anonymity. But you enable bad actors that way, right? So you might think, hey, it's great that people have this personal power, right? I'm empowered to control my own account of value. That's great. But if you get your laptop locked up by a hacker, right? It's called ransomware, and then they demand that they get some Zcash from you in exchange for giving you the password, well, then you're not so happy about this, right? It's an untraceable, untrackable way of extracting value, and it enables something, makes it easier for some of these bad actors to do criminal things like that. That's not exactly a great solution either. So good governance protects everyone in a way that promotes constructive behavior, incentivizes that, and protects you against the bad behavior. And we need to be thinking more deeply about that. So we want to protect the average person. We want to avoid becoming a conduit for bad actors. We want to balance the interests of different stakeholders, right? So in the Bitcoin world, right, you've got, on the one hand, you've got the interests of the Bitcoin miners, right? They get a fee. That's their interest. Then you've got the Bitcoin holders, right? Some of them are just traders. They're just looking for the maximum Bitcoin value right now. Some people are, maybe some of you have heard this, there's a cryptocurrency meme called the hodler, H-O-D-L, because somebody misspelled hold one time. And so they call them hodlers. And there are people who they buy Bitcoin and they hold it forever, or they hodl it forever. And they don't care about all these fluctuations. But if you're in it for the long term, maybe you don't care as much. But that's a different kind of interest than the short-term trader. You want to improve the stability. You want to study the lessons of history in non-digital governance and see how have things played out. We've had thousands of years of governance experiences and experiments in governance out there, and now we've suddenly got a new set of tools with the blockchain we've never had before, right? And what can we learn from that, and how can we experiment and do new things that were never possible before? So some people say, well, why do you even need governance, right? So, why can't we just define the system like Satoshi did with his paper, and that's it? We don't need to make decisions. But you know what? You always are going to have to make decisions for the entire group. They're going to have to be made at some point because you can't predict the future, and you're going to have to react as new knowledge comes in, as circumstances change. They're going to be made. So would you rather have it so that it's not really discussed how those decisions are being made, or would you rather have it be extremely well-defined, have a lot of transparency to it, and a lot of accountability for whoever's making those decisions? There's the debate of, should it be centralized or decentralized, and what sort of balance between that? What kind of decisions are allowed, right? So with Ethereum, right, as I was saying, there was this principle of, well, we can't change something once it's happened. Once it's in the blockchain, it stays that way forever. And then with Bitcoin, there are things like, okay, well, there's only 21 million Bitcoins that are ever going to be created. We're not going to change that. Or, who gets to decide if that should change, or should it never be changeable at all? And how do you limit those decisions, and how are those limits enforced? And who gets to make those decisions? If you don't know who gets to make those decisions and what that process is, that's not a good thing. You should know that. So we have a lot of different systems for comparison. We've got the non-traditional ones. I know a lot of people who are attracted to the blockchain world are, in the more experimental category, right? Anarcho-capitalists and libertarians and so on, and they've always dreamed, hey, why can't we have less of that governance, right? And instead have it be something we can trust more. They've seen that our non-digital governance systems have problems. They don't seem to perform well, and I'm very suspicious of them. Very sympathetic to that view. You have corporate governance, right? Corporate governance functions reasonably well. It functions on the behalf of its shareholders. It's fairly well known. It's not perfect either. And you have state governance. And right, if you've been paying attention the past couple of years to the U.S. election system and so on, people's frustration with that is pretty high. It seems like it's at the breaking point in a lot of ways. And we have digital examples. We have Bitcoin, which has a very minimalist governance system. We have Ethereum and Tezos, which have more of a corporate governance system. And we have things like Neo and FedCoin, these new kind of coins that are basically derived from governance systems, state governance systems. So let's talk about this centralized versus decentralized debate. There are a lot of sort of religious believers in the idea of decentralization. The more decentralization, the better. Now, that may seem like it's a great thing, right? Let's maximize decentralization. We can limit the concentrations of power, and if you don't concentrate the power, you don't create a juicy target to attack and to try to manipulate it. You get greater freedom of choice. We see how these forks happen, and it allows all the different experiments to happen. That's all a good thing. There's lots of ideas that have been tried, and we've learned a lot, right? So Satoshi created Bitcoin, and we've watched it go through all sorts of different things. We've learned a ton. It's time to start rethinking some of that and figure out what can we do better? How can we make Bitcoin better, Ethereum better? What kinds of new experiments can we do? But the idea that anything centralized is evil, I think that's actually a very naive way to think about it, right? Because you have to do something centralized. Some things are done better centralized. But if you make something centralized, you've got to pay really, really close attention to it, right? And I work with a bunch of security researchers, and security researchers are notoriously paranoid. They go into the details of how technology works, and they're always looking for how can a hacker break in, and how can I defend against that? You have to look at whenever you have a centralization of power in an institution, how do you protect that? What are all the different ways that those things can be infiltrated and subverted and used for a purpose other than what it's supposed to be for? And whether you're talking about a technology system or a non-digital institution, there's a lot of similarities there. And I don't think we can avoid this centralization. Some things are going to have to be centralized the more we try to build institutions on top of the blockchain. So what kind of powers do you want to put in this, right? You have to think about what kind of stakeholders are allowed to go into your system. So with Bitcoin, right, one of the great things is anybody can acquire Bitcoin that wants. You could even have, you don't even have to acquire for another person. You could simply, run your own Bitcoin mining node and generate your own Bitcoin that way, right? And which is great. Now the downside of that is if you have no ability to restrict somebody, if a bad actor comes in, take the example I was giving where a hacker comes in and locks up your laptop and he says, I'll give you the password in exchange for some Bitcoin. You would love to be able to, if that person could be located, to expel him from Bitcoin forever. That would be a disincentive for him to act like that. But you can't do that with Bitcoin. But how do, the other kinds of powers, things like how are different interests managed and balanced and weighed together to make a group decision? How do those decisions get made? How is the public discourse carried out to help to try to bring a group in a certain direction? Who controls the narrative? Who controls the systems in which people are talking about it, right? So for Bitcoin, there are several centralized hubs where a lot of the public discourse happens about things like the block size debate. But who controls those? You have to think through those things because you can create the illusion that people want to go in a particular direction when really they kind of want to go in a different direction based on that control. And how are things like disputes resolved, right? So when the Ethereum folks were trying to figure out what to do with the DAO situation, when a hacker took tons of Ethereum and stole it, they had to come through and make some kind of decision and resolve the dispute that was happening. But if you don't think ahead of time, how are you going to resolve disputes and how are you going to make sure that it's a fair process that everybody in the end feels good about? If you don't define that well, it's going to create a lot of controversy and a lot of uncertainty. And also, how do you limit powers, right? So, one of the great things people love about Bitcoin, as I was saying, is that, there's only 21 million Bitcoin that's ever going to be created. But how is that limit enforced, right? So, one of the things about Bitcoin that makes people nervous is the way in which Bitcoin has been stabilized is that, it's this highly distributed set of miners, but that's gradually been consolidating into these mining pools, and now a small number of mining pools in Bitcoin have kind of consolidated and now can control more than 51% of Bitcoin. Well, what would happen if those Bitcoin miners said, hey, the block reward that we're getting is gone from 100 at the beginning, and now it's only down to 12.5, and it's going to get cut again? What if we changed that and said, let's get 100 again, right? And so a few of those groups of miners said, let's just make it 100 again, and they started doing that. What's to stop them? That's a difficult decision to make. So I want to talk a little bit about NDAO. NDAO is a new cryptocurrency that COSIMO Ventures, my company, is involved with, and it's not ready. It's not the right time to be formally announced, but I want to use this and set up a little context for what I'm going to talk about a little more deeply and how we solve these problems. So consider this like a sneak preview, and it's about what I want to propose calling comprehensivist digital governance. This is digital governance where all the details are laid out. It's all made explicit. The decision process is there. All the related institutions involved in governance are all put together. They're all laid out in front. It's transparent. It's highly accountable. It's responsive to you. There's not a lot of mysteries. Now, NDAO is designed for long-term store value. It's got assets that are behind it that support the monetary policy of it to be more stable, but it's not a stable coin, it's not an ETF, it's something kind of new. I'm going to leave the bulk of what NDAO is about for a future announcement for when the NDAO folks are ready for that, but I just want to set this up for what I'm going to explain about where digital governance is going. It's very important that with NDAO, if you want to have something that's more stable, though, you have less uncertainty. You don't want a lot of forks going around. So the digital governance is much, much more clearly spelled out and thought through, and everybody understands that going into it. So comprehensivist digital governance cares about that average person. Like right now, you probably wouldn't tell your grandma to go buy a bunch of Bitcoin and put half her life savings in it, right? She might lose her key, it might get stolen, fraud might happen, there's really no recourse, right? We want to be friendlier, though, to the average person, and our institutions are what help protect us from those kind of problems. And some of those problems we can't even predict. It has to be resilient and respond to whatever may happen, even if we hadn't thought about it in advance. We have to think about how has our non-digital governance systems worked well in the past and not worked well in the past. How can we take these new blockchain tools and solve problems in ways that the founding fathers of the country didn't have access to? They couldn't have used these tools. We have an opportunity to try a lot of new things. You have to think about things like who can be a stakeholder? How do the election systems work? A lot of people were frustrated with this last election cycle. Why is that? Digging down into the deeper levels, not the textbook of how our country is supposed to work, but what are all the levels below that that are not always spoken about up front? The internet is great because now you can research that stuff to your heart's content and truly understand that, and we can fix those things with blockchain. So with NDAO, we have a primary governing body called the Blockchain Policy Council with 9 delegates. These delegates are cryptographically elected using multiple voting systems so that it's very difficult for any one kind of voting system to dominate that system, and it distributes power more. All the decisions are transparently made to the blockchain, and the delegates are instantly and highly and painfully accountable to shareholders. I'm sure many people here would love to see their politicians be held more painfully accountable to their decisions. So this is a key takeaway slide from how NDAO governance works. The accountability is vastly more important than how diffuse or decentralized the governance process is. The Blockchain Policy Council delegates are held to the principles of NDAO and their campaign promises via staking. So imagine if your politician that was running for office had to put $10 million bond down before he could be elected, and he's held accountable, and that could be confiscated from him if he doesn't live up to his principles and his campaign promises. The delegates can be instantly recalled by stakeholders. So if they start going off track of what they said they were going to do, you can yank them back. And in cases where a decision would be difficult to reverse, there's a temporary period where you can have that option to yank them before it goes into effect. Now, these are things that you could propose that these happen in the non-digital world, but good luck getting it changed. It's kind of very hard to get that kind of aircraft carrier to turn, right? It changes very slowly. The great thing about in the blockchain space now, since we're very early, you can create something new and try out something new that's never been done before, and this is part of the adventure. When you have strong transparency and rapid accountability mechanisms, the power stays with the stakeholders rather than lost to the governors. So how should you limit these powers? Well, in NDAO, there are no absolute limits. You cannot know in advance what you may need to change in the future. But the key is you make it much, much harder to change things that are fundamental to the system. In the same way, in the U.S. Constitution, there are some things you can change with a simple majority vote in Congress, and some things like a constitutional amendment that require a much more elaborate process are much harder to do. You kind of have to look at these things and figure out what's worked well, and then try to see if you can emulate those or do them one step better in the blockchain world. And it's not just governance, but there's a lot of interrelated institutions that all have to be in it, and this is a part of what a comprehensivist solution is about. So you need to not just have digital governance, policy, rules, and incentives. You need to have dispute resolution. You need to have identity systems, as Tim mentioned, how the software is developed, and epistemology systems, right? By epistemology systems, how is it we know we can agree on what's true, right? Consensus systems are a way of evaluating what is our commonly held truth that we can agree is truth. And if you look out in the non-digital world and you see people shouting fake news at each other, right, we can see our epistemology systems are breaking down. The blockchain is a technology that can be used to start to fix that kind of problem. Now, in the NDAO case, since you have assets backing it, this is really important. You can't just do another fork. You need to have a really comprehensive solution for digital governance that moves everybody in a direction where everybody feels like they were heard, their interests were felt, and they keep going in a direction where everybody feels like it's been fair. And because if you try to do a split, where do the assets go, right? With Bitcoin, there's no assets behind it, so it doesn't really matter. But when you start trying to have more stable kinds of coins, you have to figure out where those assets go. And you need digital governance over those assets, right? You want to be able to trust it. With Tether, nobody kind of really knows how is new Tether getting created, where are the assets behind it being held, how are they being managed, how do we know somebody's not, how do we know they exist, how do we know if they're getting, somebody's running off with them? We don't have any answers to that. You really need something with more accountability than that. Now, you might say, hey, well, we already have these institutions in the non-digital world. Why don't we just use, our existing court systems for dispute resolution? Well, the problem is that there's a mismatch, right? You have, on the one hand, you've got this idea of if you hold a private key, you control that cryptocurrency, but that's not the same as an identity of somebody who that owns something and trying to protect their interests in that ownership. So this is the future we're looking towards, right? And we're still in the first half of the first inning. There is a lot more to happen here. It's a very deep subject. I only have enough time here to touch on it briefly here. But I want to encourage people to think about this, question the non-digital world, and see what can we do better in the digital world and improve upon what's currently happening in the crypto space and in the non-digital governance space. Thank you.
Nice job. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ken. That was really good stuff. Very challenging. As somebody who got involved in politics about 6-8 years ago because of the things that were disturbing me, a lack of accountability, it's intriguing to think about what might happen if we could hold our elected officials to their promises. Well, we're going to take a 5-minute break. I've been asked to tell you that right behind this room, right behind me, is a courtesy suite. If you decide to go over there and take a break, you can still hear the conference. You'll hear our next speaker, and you'll be able to watch on a screen. And there are also more seats over there, too. So some of you are having a hard time finding a seat. You want to take a break to relax over there and enjoy the refreshments. Feel free to do so. We will resume in 5 minutes.